Maybe we should start with some definitions for people, right? Like we would call peripheral fatigue a failure to meet metabolic demands, right? Well, do you think that that is encompassing enough?
It could be broader demands, right? It could be just like a task, demands of the task due to peripheral failure.
Right? Like essentially your body, you're not able to use oxygen well enough to create muscle contraction and you reach task failure.
Yeah. Even before, yeah. Task failure.
Where like an example would be, I want you to row 500 meters at a 120 per 500 meter pace. But well, my best is 130. So right around the 300 meter mark, I'm going to reach task failure. And I won't be able to do that because of peripheral fatigue.
Yeah. Yeah. No matter how motivated you are, your muscles cannot produce enough force, and the energy metabolic processes just aren't going to be able to produce that output.
Yeah. It's important to separate it from, I think when we say something like force, it's important to separate it from something like a 1RM back squat, where there's more at play with like the actual contractility of the muscles. The muscles aren't big enough and they're not contracting in a way that will allow you to perform. Like, I want you to do a 500-pound back squat. Well, I'm just not strong enough. Different from the row example where you could hold that pace for some time, but not long enough. And that's peripheral fatigue.
Yeah. Yeah. Fatigue is really all about some sort of sustained or repeated effort not being up to par, rather than the absolute maximum or any given like momentary part of that not being enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
So
defined by its accumulation, I guess, right?
yeah. Yeah.
But then, so that's peripheral fatigue. We want to focus the topic of our discussion today more around the central factors of fatigue. And that, I guess that would start at the neuromuscular junction.
Yeah. Or even higher. Maybe the neuromuscular junction is part of the peripheral. It could go either way, I think.
Even when you factor in that ability to handle potassium, calcium, sodium.
Yeah, I don't know. That one I'm not sure. I think I've seen it both ways here. I think somewhere in here there was neuromuscular junction was included with peripheral, but
maybe it's a back and forth type of thing.
yeah, I think that one could go either way. But yeah, I think for our purposes, it probably makes more sense to include everything except the muscle in central, right?
Yeah.
Because the motor neuron comes from the central nervous system. So
there's that. There's the ability of the motor neuron to excite the muscle. And there's a potential for fatigue inside of that, right? Think of that like, the wires that the contacts on your car battery. Sometimes in an old car, they get really oxidized and that connection is not as good. And then you've got the wire itself, which is the nerve, and there's conductivity within that nerve. What would be the fatigue that would take place in that nerve relative to conductivity?
a loss of the gradient, or a disruption of the sodium potassium gradient, right? So if it's sustained or repeated activation of that neuron for long enough or enough times, it's just not going to have time to recover that charge difference between the inside and the outside at some point, right?
And that is, I'm sure you did a lot more learning about neurophysiology than I did. I think I read a neurophysiology textbook 10 years ago. But that's describing the action potential. And there's a silent period, right? And it would be the reduction in the silent period, right? So essentially the ion gated nerve pathways are being held open because the gradient is being disrupted, and that nerve just gets overloaded, right?
Yeah.
Is that an accurate explanation of what's going on there?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And that is very quick to recover.
Very quick to recover. Yeah. I'm excited to get into the recovery parts of the CNS, because I think as we get into that, it'll be eye-opening for a lot of the listeners who use CNS in its common term. And then as we get deeper into fatigue and what it actually is and what it means and how we interpret it, it'll broaden our understanding as well. And then at the spinal cord, so those nerves, they go, motor, axon, nerve, spinal cord, which travels up to your brain. What are we seeing at the spinal cord?
So there's the changes in the like reflex inputs, right? So with sustained contractions, you lose the stretch reflex, which is facilitating. So you lose that, which takes away some drive, right? Same with the Golgi. Eventually that drops off. So you lose some of the facilitation. And then that's also where some of the inhibition can start. So the interneurons can synapse on the motor neuron and either facilitate activation of it or inhibit, right? So that's where we start to see some of those inputs.
I feel like I often stand in as the lay interpreter. So in that sense, people have heard of, a lot of people, well, and some people may not have heard of muscle spindles. And you mentioned the Golgi tendon. And muscle spindles are sensing the stretch that's being placed on a muscle. And they send what's called monosynaptic signal to and from the spinal cord. So we've got these muscle spindles. They're called afferents. Anything that comes from the muscle to the spinal cord up to the brain is an afferent. It's something that we sense. Anything that descends downward is an efferent. And in these monosynaptic relationships, the muscle spindle sends a signal to the spinal cord. What makes it monosynaptic is it doesn't ascend any further. It goes spinal cord, comes back out, and the efferent is that driving. What was the term you used? I think you said drive. It senses the stretch, and the spinal cord says, okay, activate. And it's just this closed loop. And we see that when you go to the doctor and they tap you on your patellar tendon with a little hammer and your knee kicks out. It senses the stretch and your spinal cord says, activate. And then you kick. And if you're Superman, you kick the table through the door. And if you're a normal person, your leg just kind of flicks like that. So when you have fatigue at the spinal cord, because that muscle spindle is in a stretch position for so long, it doesn't recognize that drive and it starts to downregulate it. Accurate?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, these like reflex changes, it's definitely related. Maybe it's not quite the same thing as fatigue, but they're changes that affect muscle contraction and performance. So I think it, makes perfect sense to have them in this discussion, right?
So that's an interesting point. Let's jump ahead. What is the recovery course for those levels of fatigue?
I think those ones are pretty quick. I don't actually know.
Like 30 seconds to 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of the studies that they did, they were testing. It would be cool for us to get into the study methods too, because that was really interesting stuff. But the way that they tested it would be like, okay, there's a decrease in surface EMG, and it was recovered in 30 seconds to 2 minutes. So that level of CNS fatigue is extremely transient. It's gone.
Yeah. Those reflexes are recovered, I think, instantaneously though. Like if you can just keep banging your knee with a hammer and it'll keep doing that, but you lose that with a sustained stretch.
Right.
So the reflexes, it recovers like really, really quick. But yeah, once you start sustaining, then it goes away. And then the goal is like the opposite, right? It's an inhibitory reflex, not muscle contraction.
So in the studies that they performed, they were having people do like repeated sprint intervals, testing MVC, maximal voluntary contraction with surface EMG. So basically the surface EMG measures how much drive is being applied to that muscle. And in between sprints, they're seeing surface EMG go down. And then 30 seconds to 2 minutes after the test was done, where they do like 10 by 15 meter sprint at all out effort, during the 30 seconds of rest, depression, 30 seconds to 2 minutes after, it's almost fully recovered again. Yeah, that's kind of how they're measuring that.
Yeah. And then there's those other kind of layers that you can stack on those measurements, right? So then I guess we're ascending further into the brain to get those. So you have your maximal voluntary force or contraction for the muscle. You measure that, and then performance outcomes as well. So max jump height or the sprint performance or lifting performance. So you've got like an observable outcome, then you've got max voluntary contraction, which is like this experimental thing. And then you can experimentally contract their muscle, right? So you can apply a direct current to the muscle, which just bypasses the central nervous system entirely. Or you can apply a current directly to the brain with TMS. So that is then just basically controlling the whole system. So you've got all these layers, and then you can compare before and after with all of these tests, before and after with the outcome measures, MVC, max jump height, lifting, whatever, and then do it again with some activation at whatever level you want to kind of separate out.
Yeah. And that's how they're kind of pinpointing the location of fatigue within the CNS. So the CNS is this great big apparatus from nerve ending to brain. And there's levels within it. And they're using these different testing methods to pinpoint the level at which fatigue is occurring. And then beyond that, you then have to kind of like guess at or figure out what the mechanism is for fatigue. Let's talk a little bit about the study design so that listeners can understand a little bit more, because we're just throwing out these words, MVC, TMS, so on and so forth. MVC, maximal voluntary contraction, or you'll sometimes hear MVIC, maximal voluntary isometric contraction. Typically what they do is they put you in like a leg extension machine that you would see at a normal gym. They set it at a very specific angle, and they put the resistance at a very specific place around your ankle. So sometimes they use something that you kick into. Sometimes they use a strap with a load cell on the back of it, and a load cell just measures force. Think of it like a fishing weight that you pull on it and it gives you a readout. And they have you sit and kick as hard as you possibly can. One of the really constraints, I guess, there's a better word for it, but an important thing that you need to have in these studies is appropriate motivation. So one of the ways they do that is just verbal encouragement. Another way is they have a digital readout on a screen in front of the person and like a target, so that they're trying to hit this maximal voluntary contraction. And then they have sensors on the muscle to read how much drive is coming to the muscle. And then in one of your examples, they have probes sometimes the probes are in the muscle, like with a needle. Sometimes there's surface probes that go on top, and they can contract the muscle to what they use as a maximal voluntary contraction, but isn't necessarily a maximal voluntary contraction because it doesn't take into account synergist muscles and antagonist, relaxation, all of that aspect. But basically, there's like, this is this muscle under maximal contraction. And then the TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, is really cool because it just sends something straight down from the top. And some of the studies that they do is they have somebody kick as hard as they possibly can. They fatigue them, or they'll kick at a force and hold it for as long as they can. And they're measuring the force, and then they're measuring surface EMG. So they're understanding the drive. And then they apply the stimulus directly to the muscle, and they see how much harder you can kick once you get a little jolt. And then they measure that discrepancy, or they zap your brain and it comes down. And again, if there's an increase, they're measuring the difference. And that's how they're kind of measuring fatigue. But the important, as I ramble, I think the important part of our discussion is the lasting effects of CNS fatigue, because these measurements are taking place in real time.
Yeah. And then the other thing they add to that is the like outcome, the performance testing as well. So then they can compare the changes in the MVC or whatever to the actual performance changes of like a jump or a sprint. So I think the big takeaway for me, and we were kind of already suspected this or knew this to some extent, right? Is like the larger changes in terms of magnitude, but also duration of CNS fatigue are more from sustained efforts than from high intensity efforts, let's say. So endurance rather than strength, right? Like,
right.
The central fatigue is more pronounced and lasts longer from doing a lot of something rather than doing something really, really hard for a short period.
Yes. And I think that's what's going to be valuable and relevant to the listeners is, okay, so we're talking about these measures of fatigue and how they're so transient. But when you hear the word CNS fatigue, it's people who are like, oh, I did all these heavy deadlifts yesterday and my CNS is torched from all these heavy deadlifts. And that is very common among coaches, among athletes and casual gym goers. But the research, when you actually get through the semantics of it all, is telling us that the fatigue that occurs at the CNS from very intense work is transient. It recovers very, very quickly.
Yeah, that roughly like 30 seconds, 2 minutes, like on that order a lot of the time.
But they do see a bit more of a down regulation. Still, like we're talking probably 30 minutes to a couple of hours post something like a 10K or a marathon, even something like UTMB, which is a 166 kilometer trail run through the European mountains. What mountain range is it?
Is that in France?
It starts in France and finishes in Italy. It goes France, Switzerland, Italy.
Oh yeah.
I just can't remember what mountains are called.
Yeah.
But it's crazy. It's like one of the most well-known ultra endurance races, up to 24 hours. Measured CNS fatigue. There were a couple interesting studies in there too, comparing CNS fatigue, back squat, deadlift, bench press. No difference. There was another one specifically comparing the back squat and the deadlift. No difference. And that workout was brutal. Trained lifters, I think back squat was like around 350 pounds. Deadlift was around 420 pounds on average. So they're not like elites, but they're not novices either. 8 sets of 2 reps at 95% 1RM. You're like, whoa. If anything is measuring intensity, it's that workout. and no difference between the two. So that kind of puts to bed the idea that the deadlift is the most fatiguing to the CNS, and that like the more whole body movements you do and the higher the intensity, the more you're going to fatigue your CNS. And then we see with the research around endurance efforts that it places a higher demand on CNS, but it still recovers fairly quickly, all things considered.
Yeah. And in that squat and deadlift study, the maximum voluntary contraction was recovered within 30 minutes after that workout.
It was fast.
So central fatigue was essentially gone in 30 minutes after the hardest deadlift or squat session you've ever done, basically. Hardest in terms of intensity, not volume.
Yeah. I think one of the limitations within that is that the MVC test that they did was a seated leg extension, and it was measuring activation of the vastus lateralis, so a knee extensor. So the argument could be made that, well, you don't really use your quads in the deadlift as much as you do in the back squat. But if it's your CNS that's fatigued, it shouldn't matter what muscle group it is anyway, because it doesn't have anything, it's proximal to the muscle. So fatigue is fatigue.
Yeah. Yeah. So which muscle you activate isn't important for measuring central fatigue. What they're trying to find out is like, when can they provide the same central drive as before the test? And that can be accomplished with any muscle. If you were measuring peripheral fatigue, then you'd want to measure the muscles that was worked to compare before and after. And they did that as well, right? Did they do counter movement jump?
I don't think they did.
No
Maybe
jump.
they did. I'd have to got it right here.
But another interesting thing is, I can't remember which study it was, but even with central fatigue, the performance indicators can sometimes return to baseline before central fatigue has actually gone away. Can't remember which study. Was it the sprinting study? And jump height was back to normal before the central fatigue had actually dissipated. So there was actually like an increase, and this happens, it's another useful concept, well-known concept, especially in the very short term, is post-activation potentiation, right? So you can actually, not only do you not get a decrease in performance, the hard effort actually improves performance immediately after via, increased excitability. So I think sometimes the performance measures can actually recover before the central fatigue is dissipated. I just can't remember which study showed that.
So an example of that would be something like, you might do a trap bar deadlift at 90% 1RM for 1 to 3 reps, and then go into a max effort broad jump or a max effort triple jump. And performing that deadlift immediately before your jumping effort, you'll reliably see an improvement in your jump score even though there would be lingering central fatigue.
Exactly. Yeah. So that kind of complicates the whole central peripheral picture. But that's, that's the whole basis of contrast training, right? So that's why people do a heavy thing before a fast, powerful thing. And it works really well.
Yeah, that's interesting. It could be like, I would assume the main benefit of that is coordination. You are organizing your body and your skeleton, number one, and then the muscle firing patterns around high force production. And there's a phase where you're still organized and you're kind of almost stiff to be able to apply force better.
Yeah, I think that effect only lasts like 15 seconds or so with that particular, and probably would I'd be interested to look into this though. It probably wouldn't work if the movements were different enough, right? Like you couldn't do a heavy bench and then a broad jump.
Yeah, even more would be like a heavy bicep curl.
Yeah.
Right? Like a bench is, I think, probably whole body enough that you would get some improvement, far less than like maybe like a split squat iso, like overcoming asymmetric or a trap bar deadlift or something like that. But I think that the intensity of that contraction would transfer better. But yeah, I get what you're saying. It has to be the more specific, the better.
Yeah. Yeah. But that other, what you just said was the thing that it would be interesting to see demonstrated experimentally is this generalized increase in excitability from a hard effort. That probably is the case, right? That's what Stu McGill used to call it, like irradiation.
Right. There was early in that Gandevia one, they talked about it. So research into this started in the 1800s. I can't remember the researcher's name, but he was, one of the things that he noticed was that effort, or basically MVC, would improve after the firing of a gun.
Fear.
So, and you use the term excitability, and that's exactly what's going on, right? So all you need to do is excite yourself, and boom, you're going to have an increase in performance. Your central nervous system will be more activated.
Yeah. Arousal.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the like higher level central components is like arousal. And smelling salts. It's one way to do it.
Oh yeah.
Slap in the face.
Yeah. So that's, I feel like we did a fairly good job defining the CNS and what CNS fatigue is. Why is there such a disparity between what it is and how it's used in common reference?
I think it's interesting. I think probably there's different cases for this. It seems like, especially with the deadlift case, it's probably like an emotional, cognitive kind of thing where they're perceiving peripheral fatigue and then they're kind of calling it central fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's like, I feel whatever, therefore my nervous system must be like down, right? Whereas you could then go in and prove the exact opposite. So like after the deadlifts, you just feel kind of sore, probably a lot of your body is kind of sore, but it's probably mostly peripheral fatigue. And then there's all the, cognitive stuff that happens. And then that comes out as, they call it central fatigue or whatever, right? So that seems to be probably what's happening with that case. Because there is all those like higher order, again, that term that I'm using, higher order, I'm talking about like levels of like brain development. So like the cortical, like conscious kind of part of it is like the highest order, and then the like subconscious middle of your brain, slightly less, and then your spinal cord is like the most primitive, so kind of like lowest order.
It's interesting. When I did read that one neurophysiology, actually it's been present for stuff, but think about it in terms of evolution, right? Like we evolved as single cell organisms, and then we became multi-cell organisms, and then we started to turn into creatures. And as you go further and further back, you think about like alligators and crocodiles, and there's not a whole lot of cognitive processing going on there, right? So this like spinal cord, and then this almost like the base of our brain is what they have, maybe a little bit more. And as we developed, it's like we grew more brain, and it kept stacking onto the farthest part forwards. And at the very front of our brain is all of our most human cognitive processing. That's where that happens. So as you go from the front to the middle to the back and then to the spinal cord, they're responsible for different types of actions within our body.
Yeah. Yeah. Named for four-legged animals. So it's named forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. So if you just like look up and pretend, or pretend you're a dog and you're on your hands and knees, look forward, and then it kind of makes sense, right? Front, middle, back.
Yeah.
More advanced to more primitive, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the like emotional, well, I guess emotional is kind of like that mid-level, but the motivational is definitely that kind of higher level. So maybe, after a really hard workout, there's a loss of motivation to train really hard, or a fear of that training hard again right away will produce an injury. And so then those things, again, are central. But that's not to say that they wouldn't be able to activate their muscles to the same degree. It's just their like top-down control is changing how they're just feeling different about training, right?
It is a feeling, and a feeling only.
Yeah.
And it has nothing to do with a measurable level of fatigue. It is only a feeling. Which, I don't know where to go with this. My big pushback against the term CNS fatigue is I feel like it creates an unnecessary and unpresent fear in athletes that this training session is going to cause this outcome, when the reality is that's just not true. You're recovered, you can do it. But the way that you feel about that does matter very much. So all of the work from Mark Cora dives into this, what they call performance fatigue and perceived fatigue. And I think when people use the term CNS fatigue, what they're referring to is perceived fatigue, where performance fatigue is what we were talking about, is peripheral fatigue. It's measurable, it's predictable, we know exactly how it occurs, in most cases when it will occur based upon different power outputs. But this perceived fatigue is more of a feeling. It's more attuned to an emotion than it is to something that's measurable. And it's influenced by many, many different things. You had talked early on about type 3 and 4 afferents. So again, afferents they send signals to the spinal cord and up to the brain. And type 3 and 4 afferents are nociceptors. They sense pain and discomfort. And when we do our workout, we get delayed onset muscle soreness and we experience pain. And we learn to associate that pain with fatigue. And we think, oh, I'm tired. And that was your explanation of the deadlift. And, well, it's not causing more central fatigue, but it's probably causing a lot of delayed onset muscle soreness, which we perceive as fatigue, even if it doesn't reduce our performance or impact our performance.
Yeah. Yeah. Like if you were motivated enough, or you had that external kind of experimental activation, you'd be able to perform just the same, but you feeling like you can't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I like to say how we feel about how we feel.
Yeah.
Certain people will feel a different way, right? Like, sometimes you go to the gym, or you do like more of a pump session. You're kind of like, your upper back is tight and your shoulders are tight. And you're like, I feel strong. Like, I feel like I could lift more tomorrow because I feel so strong. And maybe you could. And another person might take that same feeling, which we feel the same, and they might feel a different way about it. Oh, I'm really stiff and tight and sore. I need a rest day. I don't want to go back in the gym tomorrow because I'm feeling fatigued. For some people, they feel motivated by it, and some people feel like they need to rest from it.
Yeah. And this kind of has to be, I'm sure there's lots of people that have looked into this, but how you feel about those things has to be a big influence on your level of achievement, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Guys and girls that go on to an elite level, they just wouldn't have gotten there if they had backed away from stuff on a regular basis, right? They feel that soreness and they're like, sick, let's go do some more. Or they get a little bit beat up and then they think, okay, well, let's just train something else really hard tomorrow. Maybe not the exact same thing because I'm feeling fatigue, but still hard, but something else.
Or they had coaches along the way
Yeah.
that had what they intuitively sensed where the limits of that athlete were. And they had good communication strategies, and, they talked to them in a way that convinced them that what you're feeling is not going to slow you down. You can push through this and you can continue to train and you won't get hurt. You won't get sick. You won't get injured. You're good. And you just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And they trusted in that process. And as a result, they were able to accumulate more training over time and they got fitter than their competitors.
I had a moment like that today with the dumbbell. I thought about quitting. I was like, oh man, I'm so tired.
Oh yeah. It's funny how that just creeps in on you, hey? I used to yell when I was a younger coach and I was less polished, I used to yell at my clients all the time. Tired is a choice. And it's like, kind of. But in a lot of cases, I would say in most cases, it is a choice. And this is really well seen in a lot of studies that they do where they'll have different groups. They put them on a bike and they tell them to pedal at a certain number of watts. And they'll have different motivators in front of them. So certain groups get an open-ended task. It's like, I just want you to hold this as long as you can. And then maybe at a certain point, they'll be like, okay, you have 5 more minutes. Or another group gets just a task that they need to complete. I need you to cycle at this watts for this amount of time or for this amount of distance. And when they see that endpoint, the motivation is higher and they typically have better results. So the motivational piece of that is, I would argue, the most important piece of perceived fatigue. How motivated are you?
Yeah. When you can't see the finish line, you pace a lot more conservatively.
Yeah. And you're just willing to give up, knowing that you don't know how long you would have to endure this for. I don't know how much more I'm going to have to endure of this discomfort. I'm quitting now. Whereas if somebody were to be like, okay, you have 1 more minute, you can hang on for 1 more minute. And if they kept doing that to you, oh, sorry, I made a mistake. It's just 1 more minute. And they just kept adding on 1 more minute, you would probably get many more minutes knowing that you only had 1 more minute.
Yeah. And I think lots of people listening will understand this pretty intuitively if they've done CrossFit. Rounds for time versus AMRAP.
Oh yeah, rounds for time is way easier. Well, not easier, but it's easier to push yourself harder because you can see the end.
Yeah. If in an AMRAP, you don't know how many rounds you're going to get, you just can't go as hard, right? Or it's a longer workout or whatever, right? But I think that's something probably people have felt pretty intensely.
Yeah. We did a workout on Saturday and it was like 1 round every 6 minutes for 4 rounds. And after the 3rd round, I was cooked. And I was like, you know what? I don't need this. I'm not a CrossFit competitor. This is not good for me. Like, it's not bad for me, but it's like, I'm not winning from doing this. I should just stop. And then my 4th round, I think it took twice as long as my first, 2nd, and 3rd. It was so bad.
So performance fatigability versus perceived fatigability. Interesting, kind of different. They call it their proposed taxonomy, right?
Yeah.
Interesting.
And it's like perceived fatigability. It folds in with this concept of durability, which is fatigue resistance. And what they find in research is that the more time that you have accumulated training, the higher your durability score, the more resistant you are to fatigue. And part of that is probably because you're fitter. But the biggest part is that you feel differently about how you feel. You have had more time to soak up and digest the feelings of being tired than your competitors have, and you're just more comfortable with it. And that it can be experiences, all kinds of things. It can be the way that your coach spoke to you, injuries that happened along with it. But essentially what it is your body is not reacting to stimuli. It is sensing the future. So you've run at a pace multiple times. And this is exactly what happened to me on the weekend, actually. So the workout was run, handstand push-up, toe to bar, and overhead squat. And I have been exclusively running. And I'm getting more comfortable running at a faster pace. So I ran at that pace. And I'm like, oh, this is fine. I'll be fine. I run at this pace all the time. But I have not been doing it with handstand push-ups, toes to bar, and overhead squats. So once that started to happen and I started to feel a certain way, I was like, I'm going to die. But I miscalculated my pacing based on an unrelated experience to do with running. So I was running too fast for the work that I was about to do and going to do subsequently because I felt a certain way about that, about what I was expecting, not what I was feeling. And that's how fatigue is in this corollary discharge. What was the one that you mentioned?
Oh, taxonomy.
The taxonomy.
Yeah.
Yeah. All of the things that go into teaching us about how we should feel about what we're doing. It's hard to wrap your brain around the idea that it's predictive instead of responsive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it gets more and more interesting, but more and more complicated when you incorporate higher brain functions. So a lot of these papers were, this one that we were just talking about was like not happy with central versus peripheral because they're either you can't measure it accurately or it's not capturing the functional changes or the, changes in higher brain function. But like their proposal is like just complicated in a different way.
Yeah.
It's still like really complex and you still can't it's still like not as simple as this type of fatigue and this type of fatigue. They're always back and forth, right? You're always feeling things that are peripheral and that changes how you do things or how you emotionally feel about those things. So that, when we say feel, like in terms of peripheral, it's like physical sensations in your body, and then feelings as emotions. We're kind of using both of those as feeling.
Yeah. You're feeling the burning in your muscles. You're feeling the heat on your skin. You're feeling the increase in your respiration. You're feeling your heart beating harder. And you're telling yourself a story about what all of those things mean.
Yeah.
And that story is not always accurate.
Yeah.
And in the highest level performers, it's as accurate as it can be. They know how to ride that line as close to the limit as they possibly can.
Yeah. And then once in a while, you can push it too far, but not often.
Yeah.
Like the, what was the ultra? Not the Moab. There was one in Arizona recently.
Oh yeah. That guy was hunched over. Yeah.
I think somebody died.
Oh. And then there's other factors that will contribute to that sense of perceived fatigue, just like general stress, life stress, sleep, how well rested you are, cognitive load. This was one of the things that they realized really early on, because they were professors doing the research, and they were doing the research on themselves. If they had had a really heavy day of lecturing, they noticed that their performance was reduced. Like, well, I haven't done anything hard today. All I did was stand in a classroom and talk for 6 hours. But that cognitive load gave them, it changed their perception of fatigue, and it made it harder for them to drive muscle activation.
Yeah. And it's interesting, again, kind of bringing it back to that concept that I started with, is like, what is the mechanism of that cognitive load causing that fatigue, right? Is it like, just as simple as accumulation of metabolic byproducts in the brain, in those neural pathways? And now,
Yeah, like you just have too much ADP floating around.
yeah. Yeah. And like, honestly, it has to be something like that.
Well,
Because
for sure, partly because caffeine improves time trial performance.
Yeah.
And so you're just blocking ADP receptors and boom, you get faster. One mechanism within it, right?
Yeah. And sleep, that's part of the thing that sleep does, right? Is it allows clearance of byproducts from the brain. So yeah, it's an interesting, influence if you're working really hard on intellectual tasks, right? Non-physical work. It still has a huge impact potentially on your performance.
But it's transient.
Yeah.
It will be quickly resolved. I bet you, if you have that and you were to sit on a bike for 10 minutes and just pedal at an easy intensity or even a moderate intensity, it would be gone.
Yeah.
Or mostly gone.
Yeah. Or a bunch of caffeine.
Pleasure caffeine. Yeah. I got to go, but I think I want to close on just what I hope people get from this is that I want them to stop making assumptions about training having a specific effect on them because it is a certain type of training. And instead, learn to trust themselves more with how they feel and be comfortable pushing themselves and not labeling, I am this way because I did this, but instead exploring more about what their potential is.
Yeah, that's a great point. Let's finish with that.